Ladies and gentlemen, time to plunge into Europe and Mobilities, a Polish presidency conference subtitled Challenges and Opportunities for Socio-Economic Transformations. May I welcome you all, representing as many as 41 states. As of 8 a.m., perhaps it's 43 now, the size from Faroe Islands, inhabited by 56,000 people, to India, 1.5 billion people, with daily growth of about 56,000 people. That is as many as Faroe as there are in the world. Welcome to the Old Library of the University of Warsaw, to the three-day conference titled Europe and Mobilities, with a subtitle, Challenges and Responses for the Future. Let's put first things first. Who makes this conference for you? It is organized by the University of Warsaw, the highly dedicated teams of the Center of Excellence in Social Sciences and the Center of Migration Research, to be exact, with the support of the National Science Center Poland and the National Center for Research and Development, known here as NCBR, and the Ministry of Science and Higher Education of the Republic of Poland. This is one of the key events of the Polish presidency in the Council of the European Union. And these are already 4 reasons why it is worth being at or watching, because, ladies and gentlemen, we are streamed wide. May I extend this welcome also to those who are with us only remotely. The whole event is funded by the European Union and co-funded by the...
These are very often discussed and presented in terms of polycrisis. But frankly speaking, we do not want to talk about crisis or crisis today. Instead, we would prefer to discuss challenges and, first of all, try to seek and find together answers and solutions. Revolutions, and at least 2 of them, digital revolution and what we call green revolution. But the conference itself, it's not only about presenting evidence. Of course, we'll just try to do this, but in fact, it's about a dialogue. It's about exchange. It's about interaction. That's why you will see that all of the panels, they are constructed in quite similar way. We always have academics, but we have also tried to find some solutions. And also our keynote speakers, as you will see. Let me start, of course, with our alma mater, University of Warsaw, represented here by Professor Zygmunt Lalak. Then my thanks go, of course, to the Chancellery of the Prime Minister of Poland, and then to Ministry of Science and Higher Education for their continuous support since the very beginning of when we started thinking about the conference. Then, of course, to the National Science Center and National Center for Research and Development. And in this case, it's not only about their support, it's about continuous strengthening Polish science and also strengthening our Polish presence in European framework programs. Then, of course, to the European Commission, and in particular to DG Research and Innovation, because we've been working on this since the very beginning. So many thanks for continuous support. To 2 committees of the Polish Academy of Sciences, one responsible for demography and one for migration. They are critically important in the context of our discussions here. Also to our media partners, Oko Press and Tok FM, stay tuned as you will see coverage of the conference and discussions, talks with many presenters, speakers later using on their leaflets, on the agendas. Finally, and I'm just close to finish, I'd like to use this moment also to thank 2 groups of people who played crucial role in preparing this event. And let me start with a fantastic group of dedicated people who are just on the forefront of the organizational issues. And my thanks go, of course, to Adam, to Ania, to Justyna, Maria, Mateusz, Mikołaj, Natalia, Olga, and Romek. We all know your names, so I just keep it like this. Please accept my sincere thanks in advance. Everything will be fine, I'm sure. And last but not least, million thanks to a fantastic group of volunteers. You possibly already saw them. They are in green University of Warsaw shirts. They are here to support us and, first of all, to support you. So in case of any issues, questions, feel free to ask. We will support you as far as possible. Welcome, and I leave the floor to next speakers.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. And the next speaker is our host, His Magnificence Zygmunt Lalak of University of Warsaw, who probably doesn't need further introduction.
Well, in any case, good morning, everyone. It's it's great pleasure to see you all at this beautiful place. It is my warmest welcome to the University of Warsaw. I should extend this welcome also to everyone present online, in addition to all of you who are present on site. We are happy to host such an important event under the auspices of the Polish presidency in the European Union. Well, it is a great pleasure to have here representatives of the Polish government, including one of the vice ministers, Professor Duszczyk, our colleague, the university professor, and of course other colleagues as well. Michał Goszczyński is also member of the university community, so we feel at home here, and we are happy that you had found time to visit the university this morning. Well, I am also happy because the topic of the conference is very timely and important one. Mobility, in many respects, is at the center of our activities. When I say mobility, I mean not only crossing borders, but also freedom of movement, freedom of academic speech, freedom of exchanging ideas. So all those abstract things which lie which form the basement of the European Union, which are enshrined in various treaties, but need care and careful consideration on a daily basis to be extended and to impact properly our actions and the future of Europe, the future of all of us. Those ideas are very important to the University of Warsaw. Above 8% of our student population, those are foreigners, people who came here on foreign passports. Among academic teachers, we have at this point about 350 foreign employees at various levels, most of them about 300. Those are postdocs, those are young researchers who came to the University of Warsaw for a short period of time to share with us their experience, their talents, and who will, some of them, or perhaps even most of them, they will leave Poland and they will carry away the good experience and innovative ideas created at the University of Warsaw. This is the essence of academic mobility. We work together on universal problems, and then we share the results of that work with anyone who is interested, with anyone who forms the academic community, Europe-wide and worldwide. This is very important. This is at the heart, these ideas and these actions, they lie at the heart of our functioning, because mobility is the driver for innovation, for innovative thinking, is the driver for further development of the university and of the society as such. Well, university belongs to Europe, tries to be at the center of European activities. We are members of one of the most active university alliances in Europe, so-called For EU Plus Alliance, together with such universities like such important centers of academic innovation like Sorbonne University, Heidelberg University, Copenhagen University, Geneva, University of Geneva. This is to be the future European university. We are watching the developments at the European scale. We are watching developments in the within the academic bubble and outside of it. Well, we are watching the way international relations and international connections impact on the life of our students, not only on the actions of the university and other institutions like the university. And, we would like to participate even more actively in that exchange, in that intellectual exchange possible due to human mobility. We would like to see more and more foreign students registered at the University of Warsaw. We would like to see even more papers written within international collaborations. At this point, this is about half of our production, half of the papers prepared at the University of Warsaw in collaboration with foreign institutions, with foreign intellectuals, researchers. Well, that means at least one author of a paper doesn't have a Polish passport. That's what is the technical meaning of that statement. We would like to see the share of students, the share of young academic teachers becoming higher and higher at our university. This requires certain collaboration and certain understanding and certain actions, in fact, on the side of our government. This requires also full understanding of the whole academic community and of all the people who take part in this exchange for diversity, for the need of equity, equal approach, equal access to various facilities, to digital services, for instance. Well, and those touches upon central ideas driving academia, and those will be the issues you are going to discuss over the next 3 days. To summarize, I hope your stay at the University of Warsaw will be very fruitful. I wish you a successful meeting. I wish you fruitful deliberations. I wish you extensive networking, not only scientific, but also societal. And let the conference begin. All the best.
Thank you very much, Rector. Let this conference begin. This is the role of the opening ceremony we're participating in. And we've heard the name of the Chancellery of the Prime Minister of the Republic of Poland mentioned quite a few times. May I now invite its representative, Minister Magdalena Sobkowiak-Czarnecka, to take the floor and address us on behalf of the Polish government.
Good morning.
Morning.
Hello, good morning. I see that you all need coffee. A tough morning, isn't it? Good morning. Welcome to Warsaw. Congratulations, and I'm very impressed. Congratulations then to the organizers for impressive meeting. When I heard the list of countries involved in this conference, it's really impressive. And the issue is crucial. So I absolutely agree with the professor that the issue of mobility, it's a critical issue of European Union. The mobility, the free movement of people, of goods, this is what EU about. That's why there were no doubts that this conference will be a part of the big plan of Polish presidency in the European Council. As you all may know, the main motto, the main theme of the presidency, of the Polish presidency, is Security Europe. And I think the issues of mobility, the challenges of mobility, it is also an issue connected with security. Those times when we think about mobility, the first issue which comes to the mind, which pops up, it's of course migration. And Poland was the first country to raise in the EU the new new side of the migration. We were the first one to say that the migration could be used as a tool in a hybrid war. And this is something that we see on the Polish-Belarusian border. It's not something that I'm the best expert in, but you are lucky to have the best expert in this subject here in the room. It's Professor Maciej Duszczyk, my dear friend. He will tell you more in a moment, just after with the meeting with Americans yesterday. So his portfolio is very impressive, but you know him, he comes from this university, so for sure you know him better than me. So it's not only the issue of migration, this is also the issue of free movement of people in terms of new technologies, in the terms of artificial intelligence, and how to combine all those things. That yes, it's easier to work whenever you want to work because of the new technologies. But in those days, when the connection is easier than ever, we are more lonely than ever. So this is also the issue. When we should put the border between using the new technologies and use mobility only in this virtual world, and where we should still be in a physical way. The issue of mobility is also issue of demography. We all know that the EU is getting more and more silver. This is also the issue that we see here in Poland. That is the question about the workforce. And that's the big question that all the politicians are giving a question mark about. If we want to stop the migration flow, how we can have new people on the labor market that we are lacking. So where to find the balance on this one about migration and lack of hands on the labor market? This is another question that we are pointing out now in the EU. Also the issue of enlargement. Should the EU be bigger or not? When? In Poland, we firmly stand on the position that Ukraine should be as soon as possible a part of EU, but also we say that the process of enlargement should be merit-based. So the same rules for everybody if you want to be a part of the European Union. We are at the university, so I could not say something about science and innovation. What we did during the Polish presidency was signing a Warsaw Declaration done by Minister Marcin Kulasek, who is a minister for higher education and innovations. This declaration was signed to appeal that we need more money for innovations in the new MFF perspective that we are also discussing right now in Brussels. So the future of Europe lies in the mobility, but not only in this physical way of mobility, it lies also in this digital, intellectual and social way. I hope that you will have a very fruitful meeting. As one of the leaders of the Polish presidency, I have one rule: not only conversations, but at the end of the day, we need to get some recommendations. So I'm looking forward for the recommendations coming from this conference. I wish you a very fruitful day here in beautiful University of Warsaw. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Minister. We can definitely promise you all those recommendations. Thank you also for mentioning innovation. Just yesterday, another presidency conference ended in Krakow, EU InTech on innovation. But now, let us proceed to further ministries. We have the pleasure of welcoming here to the stage Mr. Maciej Duszczyk, Minister at the Ministry of the Interior and Administration.
Thank you very much. Dear colleagues, of course, it's my great pleasure to welcome all of you, the University of Warsaw, but on behalf of the Minister of Interior and Administration. And I was mentioned twice, and sorry for that, I didn't expect it. But of course, I don't want to speak about the situation on the Polish-Belarusian border. It is not the topic of this conference, because the topic of this conference is much more broader, to speak about the migration in a much more broader sense. And of course, for me as the university professor, but now this currently the deputy minister in Ministry of Interior, but responsible for all migration issues, and also the co-author of the new Polish migration strategy, which is a little bit controversial, of course, but I think so we touched a lot of different issues. This is 8 chapters from international protection, into the repatriations, because we shouldn't forget also the Poles who live abroad. But I think so that my role in the government is to little bit speak about the migration exactly in this broader sense. Because we shouldn't forget that migration is on the one hand is mobility, but we speak if we touch the mobility issues, we speak about the human beings, and we shouldn't forget this. It is not robots, it is not it is not animals as well, but this is the people, this is the human beings. That's why if we speak about the migration, it's absolutely necessary to think about the migration via thinking that we are human beings. And of course, Poland is the unique country. When I talk to my colleagues from over the world, I visited Bhutan, for example, 2 weeks ago on the invitation to the World Bank to share our experience as the country, which shifted from the typical immigration into immigration one fast in the history of migration. Because as you can imagine, that's 10 years ago, we had in Poland 100,000 of foreigners, 100,000. Now we have very close to 3 million. Of course, 2 million of them are the Ukrainians, million economic migrants who came to Poland before outbreak of the full-scale war against Ukraine. But of course, this is also 1 million of war refugees, and we are the home for them. When we welcome them, of course, especially in the first months, 4 months, with our open hearts. But of course, it is at now we have to also think how many of them will decide to stay with us, how many of them will decide to come back to Ukraine, but also how many of them will stay with us. And every month, the number of Ukrainians who want to stay with us, who has the stronger roots in Poland, of course, increase. That's why it is not the situation that in the relatively short period of time a lot of people decided to move back to the country. For it was the quite unique also experience of Poland. That's why we are invited many times to speak about immigration, because our experience is really unique. Because on the one hand we have the huge immigration, economic immigration, but also we are the country who is the home also for more than 1 million or war refugees. But of course, this is a very challenging time, also from political aspects. Just before this conference, I had the lecture with my students, and we discussed about the future of migration, and we touched a lot of different issues like the climate change, like the technological innovations, like the instrumentalization of migration, but also the changes of the attitudes towards migrants. It is I think so one of the biggest challenge we are facing now, and I think so we will face in the future. How to find the balance between our demand, also the labor market, but also the changing of the attitudes to our migrants, because we see this over the Europe. It is not only problem. It is not only challenges we are facing now in Poland. This is also the challenge as we can see, for example, the political discussion in different countries like Germany, like France, the government in the Netherlands collapsed yesterday due to migration, because one of the parties not accepted the policy towards asylum in the Netherlands. That's why this attitude is changing on our eyes, of course, but also we have to be prepared for these challenges. When I shortly mentioned the climate change, also the instrumentalization, using the migrants as the I don't like this word, but I think so. It is not so easy to find other ways as the weapon against us, against the democratic free market countries, and we have to find the response. Also, how to find the balance between the security, but also the humanitarian aspects of migration processes. This is very complicated, of course, but we have to manage not only in Poland, but also at the European level, and also with the relations with the United States. The Magda said that yesterday we had in Warsaw we organized as the presidency the ministerial summit between the EU and US. And the first reaction one day before, this was the clear signal from our American friends: we don't want to sign any press release together. because we have the different interests. But after the 3 hours discussions about the migration, counteract the terrorism, exchange of data, visa reciprocity, with the other aspects, the Americans in the end of the day said, no, our collaboration is absolutely crucial for us as well. That's why we would like to also sign this press release, and it is published on the website European Commission. I strongly recommend to read it, because also to show how our collaboration within the European Union, but also how we need and also we have to collaborate on the sort of different issues with overseas, United States, with Australia, with Canada, and other countries, and it is, I think, a very good signal also for us, because we didn't resign from our ideas in this press release, but of course we changed a few points, because okay, this is the compromise, but in the end of the day, we have the common press release, and very clear signal also for our enemies that we are still together, and we will exchange a lot of information concerning different hybrid and also the terroristic threats. And which is, of course, not combined with migration, but now everything is combined with the migration, to be honest, connected with migration. That's why we have to also to be sometimes very pragmatic, and that's why I'm really happy. I'm more than happy that this conference is organized at my university. Thanks you for Zygmunt to mention that also I'm the professor of the University of Warsaw. Yes, then I am currently minister, but of course I will back as soon as possible to the university. I'm dreaming to come back to university, but of course it is not so easy to connect my activity as the professor of the university and the minister in the Ministry of Interior, who is responsible more for security than the humanitarian aspect, because this is the role of the Ministry of Interior. But this is absolutely necessary. That's why I'm really more than happy that this conference is organized at the University of Warsaw. Unfortunately, I wanted to participate in the first panel. Unfortunately, the Commission for European Union will take place in Polish Sejm. Today is the meeting of the Polish Parliament, and as you can imagine, we are going to speak about the impact on migration, asylum, this part of the migration issue in European Union. That's why, sorry for that, I have to cancel my participation in this panel. That's why now I speak a little bit longer. Sorry for that, but I will be replaced by Alicja Kępka. Alicja Kępka, she's my closest collaborator. She's also very good expert on the migration issue. And sometimes she knows more than me about the migration. Thank you, Alicja, that you decided to come and replace me. And she knows everything about the migration strategy, implementation of the plan of the implementation of the strategy. That's why if you have any questions, of course, please ask Alicja. And I promise I will try to back just after they finish this commission in the Polish Parliament. I will try to come back also to listen to the, I think, so very important topics which will be highlighted during your panels. Thank you very much again. Thank you very much for Paweł for inviting me, and I wish you fantastic, fruitful conference, but also a lot of exchange of views, exchange of experience during the more informal discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Minister. Thank you. I must quote Star Wars. I have very bad feelings about it when it comes to you returning here, looking at the gravity of the subject that you are going to tackle. Without further ado, we have another ministry represented here, and it's the Ministry of Science and Higher Education. And we have with us none else but Mr. Michał Goszczyński. Could I please ask you to take the floor?
Thank you very much. Dear Director Lalak, dear Minister Duszczyk, dear Professor Kaczmarczyk, dear ladies and gentlemen. It is my great honor and pleasure to open on behalf of the Ministry of Science and Higher Education today's conference, Europe and Mobilities, Challenges and Opportunities for Socio-Economic Transformations. It feels us at the ministry and me, certainly because University of Warsaw is my alma mater, to host this important conference on University of Warsaw, a flagship Polish university. That's one of the most important research and education institutions in Poland. This conference is organized under the auspices of Polish presidency in the EU Council, which one of the main topics is Security Europe, and there is no security without tackling the topic of this conference. One of the organizers on the part of the University of Warsaw is the Center of Excellence in Social Sciences, whose activities are carried out as part of the ministerial program called Excellence Initiative Research University, which is marketed here near me. This program greatly contributes to boosting the process of internationalization of Polish science, which, as you may know, is one of the key priorities of our ministry. Since January 2024, the Polish National Agency for Academic Exchange, NAWA, has been coordinating under the leadership of the ministry the elaboration of national strategy for the internationalization of science and higher education. This process involves a participation of not only the entities from the governmental level, but also experts and stakeholders representing directly the science and academic community. It is worth emphasizing that the internationalization of higher education and science is not a goal in itself, but it is a tool consciously used to support scientific excellence, strengthen the quality of education, or the social involvement of Polish universities and science institutions, which is in line with the strategic goals of the state. When it comes to the Excellence Initiative Research University program, we can clearly see positive impact it brought. Its implementation improves the state of the public science base in Poland by, among others, enhancing the quality of research and education at the best Polish universities, and by helping attract and retain foreign and domestic talent, thanks to the introduction of more favorable work conditions, career opportunities, and staff development initiatives. I am very pleased to note that the structure of the conference reflects the guiding ideas of the program at the University of Warsaw. That is, openness, interdisciplinarity, scientific excellence, but also open relations with the world of business and politics and internationalization. Speaking of internationalization, ladies and gentlemen, as we are slowly approaching towards the end of our leadership in the EU Council, allow me to use this opportunity to briefly outline our major achievements in the area of research and innovation. The leading priorities when it comes to research and innovation in the Polish presidency in the EU Council have been openness, inclusiveness, and AI in science. In this particular spirit of being open and inclusive, we have mentioned today, Warsaw Declaration on the strategic role of the future R&I framework program that was unanimously endorsed during the Informal Competitiveness Council in March. In the Warsaw Declaration, the ministers of science from all the member states stressed that the EU framework program have proven to be the Union's main instrument for fostering excellent science, technological development and innovation, and underlined its strategic role in boosting EU competitiveness. Warsaw Declaration is a strong call for the European Commission to draft its initial proposal on the future of the framework program. The ministers also called for an adequate budget for the future R&I framework program, matching its strategic role in implementing political priorities. And as the Ministry of Science and Higher Education, we are very proud of this achievement, and we can see that the strong voice was heard. A few weeks ago, the European Commission President, Ursula von der Leyen, announced that the next framework program will remain independent, which was our most important goal. It will be connected to a European Competitiveness Fund, but it will be independent. This shows that the significance of the Warsaw Declaration, with its plea to respect the legacy of the previous framework programs, indeed resonated with the European Commission decision-making process, and the strong call inspired by the Polish presidency was heard loud and clear. Apart from the Warsaw Declaration, the Polish presidency negotiated the European Research Area Policy Agenda for 2025-2027, as well as the Council conclusions on the AI in science. These documents were accepted by the Competitiveness Council just a few weeks ago, and form a sound basis for further work on developing the European research area, as well as the European agenda for responsible, sustainable, ethical, and inclusive use of AI in science. I see that one of the conference panels is devoted to discussion of the era potential in social sciences and humanities, and we need this perspective to further develop era policies. Ladies and gentlemen, this conference has been co-financed from Horizon Europe Framework Program, the one that I mentioned several times already, and to be precise, from its Cluster 2 that supports activities related to, among other, social and economic transformations that contribute to inclusion and growth. I am very pleased to note that the Cluster 2 calls attract more and more Polish applicants. To date, 83 Polish organizations have been participated in 108 Horizon Europe Cluster 2 projects for a total net funding amounting over 40 million euro. The funding received by Polish institutions constitutes more than 3% of all funding granted so far to all the institutions within Cluster 2, and 4% of the total funding granted to institutions from the EU member states. What is more, 32% of Cluster 2 projects have Polish entity as their participants, whereas Polish institutions coordinate 8 Cluster 2 projects. The funding obtained by the Polish entities ranks Poland as 9th among the beneficiaries from all member states, but in the group of EU13, Poland is the number 1, which is very important for us and the ministry because this is a great success, and I'm really glad for that. Here I'm very glad to observe that the University of Warsaw is among the most active Polish participants in Cluster 2 projects, with 21 projects being implemented by the University of Warsaw. Thank you, Rector Lalek. Being for the total amount close to 6 million euro. This is an example to be followed by other Polish institutions and universities. With this, I would like to strongly encourage Polish entities to take an interest in Horizon Europe Cluster 2 calls, to apply in this calls, and to develop the competences to become project coordinators. We do need as many projects as possible to increase our participation in Horizon calls. Dear guests, dear ladies and gentlemen, one of the leading aims of this conference is to exchange knowledge on socio-economic change in Europe, and with this to discuss on how we can facilitate the exchange between academics, policymakers, NGOs, and international organizations. In a nutshell, the process of knowledge accumulation, use, and knowledge sharing. From the ministry perspective, we find it very important to better understand what the needs of both sides, world of science and policymakers, are, and how we can bridge the gap between them, but also what causes the limited translation of scientific research results into socioeconomic reality. In our today's complex world, with multifaceted challenges, the role of evidence-informed policymaking cannot be overestimated. This conference promises to be a great platform to discuss how we can build capacity for evidence-informed policymaking and develop knowledge exchanges between scientific communities and policymakers. Civil servants and researchers alike need to build professional competences to operate effectively at the science-policy interface. This calls for a systemic approach, strengthening and connecting national science for policy ecosystem by deploying better institutional linkages between the scientific community and organizations and the policymaking functions of the government. This whole-of-government approach, when designing national science for policy ecosystems, needs to build on subsystems around the major current policy challenges, such as the ones addressed by our today's conference. I very much look forward to hearing more about the outcomes of this conference, particularly in this area. Ladies and gentlemen, I wish you all very fruitful and inspiring exchanges. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, sir. We have already had input from our host, the university, and from the ministries. Time to go to the real capital of Europe, Brussels. From DG Research and Innovation, we have with us Mr. Michalis Moskavakos. So the floor is yours.
Dear Mr. Kosinski, dear Mr. Lalak, dear Pavel, dear participants, let me warmly welcome you on behalf of the European Commission, and a heartfelt thanks to the organizers and especially the University of Warsaw and to the speakers for opening so meaningfully the conference. It's a pleasure to join you today in lovely Warsaw with an excellent weather. My name is Michalis Moskavakos, and I work for Director General for Research and Innovation in the European Commission, and particularly in the unit that manages research in societal transformations. This conference is important. It brings together researchers, policymakers, practitioners from many countries, as we heard, and multiple disciplines. Like all presidency events, this conference is co-funded by Horizon Europe, and the goal of funding such events is to focus on the impact and the real-life changes that they can bring about. Therefore, this conference is about making a difference. It's a unique opportunity to bridge disciplines, to stimulate dialogue, and turn insights into actions, as requested by the minister earlier. In DGRTD, we are working hard and have undertaken a massive effort during the previous years to ensure that research findings don't just sit on a shelf. The research investment in Cluster 2 amounts to more than 2 billion euro in areas such as democracy, cultural heritage, and societal transformations, including topics like demography, mobility, and digital transition. We are systematically working to connect research to policymaking and to bridge the infamous gap between the research and policy worlds. It's not always easy, but it's our firm belief that good policy needs good knowledge. So, with these words, I invite you to make the most out of this conference. Listen, connect, challenge assumptions, discuss, and network. Again, many thanks to the organizers, and wish us all a very fruitful and successful meeting. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, sir. Listen, challenge, and connect. These are some of the things we certainly going to do. Thank you very much for that. We have heard all the welcomes. Time to open the door wider and learn what this conference is going to be all about. We've just heard from Mr. Moskavakos that it's about making difference and stimulating dialogue. Yes, by all means, that is precisely the reason why you will see so many actors involved in every of the 7 panels. We have academics, policymakers, representatives from international organizations, but also from NGOs. And this is the only way in Europe to go on discussing the most pressing challenges. What will this conference look like? We will have 2 expert keynote speeches, one in 6 minutes and the other one tomorrow at roughly the same time, and 7 thematic sessions in which we will reflect upon matters of great importance, especially to our region of Europe, such as the evolving migration patterns in Europe, the socio-economic implications of demographic transformations, enlargement policies of the EU and its possible future development, the democratic backsliding in Europe, alas, the transition to sustainable energy, this is also part of mobility, the socio-economic impact of the global digital transformation, and Europe's role in digital platforms and their influence on human and planetary well-being. If you're interested, you can visit the conference's website. There are 10 key topics listed there. And I bet that all these and many others will also be addressed by our conference. As you can see, all those issues are highly complex. That is why we aim, and this is the moment when I move to the purpose, the goal and idea behind our meeting, to approach it in a very constructive manner and also very concretely. First, this means that the conference will be interdisciplinary. Each panel, as I said, will include representatives from 4 types of socially involved categories of people, but also from all the branches of social sciences. Secondly, this constructive approach will also entail the participation of practitioners, so not only theoreticians involved in shaping public policy, including politicians working directly in the fields involved. Together, we will be discussing potential practical solutions to those areas. Thirdly, we aim to work with researchers associated with the University of Warsaw who are active in those specific fields. This will serve as grounds for demonstrating the crucial role played by the institutions such as the National Science Centre and the European Commission, particularly its Horizon Europe program, which supports and funds scientific research. And yes, this means that the conference will also be complemented by a series of meetings presenting upcoming calls in the Horizon Europe Framework Programme, facilitating knowledge exchange and collaboration. A dedicated brokerage meeting is slated for 6th of June. It will provide support for applicants in developing strong competitive research projects that address the challenges discussed during the conference. And for the end, we are left with the why question. Why this conference? Well, perhaps because everyone now talks about migration and mobility, or because we need to tell apart demagogy and facts. This is also a very significant thing, but perhaps, as Minister Duszczyk was very right to mention, because we have migration and mobility all around. I arrived here yesterday, and a taxi that took me from the central station was driven by Bilal from Turkey, and he would like to make his home here or in Portugal, where he believes the climate is a bit more Turkish. I was welcomed to the hotel by Olana, an Ukrainian girl. When I went out to buy a shaver, I had another girl serving me there. She was Lesia. And when I sat at the breakfast table next to me, there was Myra from the Netherlands who came here for a job interview. Although she intended to go to Singapore, she was offered a job in Warsaw, and she said, okay, I wanted to be further from my domestic trouble, but Warsaw's great. So yes, we really have a world in which we are no longer alone. I was born in Poland, where if you saw a car which read DDR or HU, Hungary, or the democratic Germany, no longer in existence, that was really, really something special. And I remember how all the children thronged about a car with a French license plate. Well, luckily, these times are over. I also recall that I saw the first black person when I was around 8. So there was no mobility, and I really promise that these were very bad times compared with the ones that are now around us. So, without further ado, let us now go on to welcome our first keynote speaker. The first keynote speaker is none other but Hein de Haas of University of Amsterdam, and he will address us on the need for a new migration paradigm. We've already heard the phrase challenges, no crises, so perhaps this is something that goes in the way of the lecture to come. Mr. Haas is known for some controversial, however, very, very well argued points, such as global migration is not at an all-time high at the moment. Climate change will not lead to mass migration, and immigration mainly benefits the wealthy, not workers. So, without further ado, do we have Mr. Haas with us in the room? Yes, we do. Sorry. Hidden at the back of the hall. It is precisely 11 o'clock, punctually on time. After the lecture, there will be an opportunity to ask some questions. And if somebody is not bold enough to ask them openly, yes, please, to ask them openly, there is a glass jar at the place where you could collect your headset. And into that glass jar, you can drop your question and it will be read after the lecture. So, without further ado, I can see that water is there, notes are there.
It's being done.
Enjoy.
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks for the invitation. Thanks for coming here. I'm really happy to share some of the insights of my over 30 years of experience in doing research on migration. Actually, my migration journey started with a holiday in Morocco back in 1987. I was 17 years old. And I then decided to do fieldwork as a geography student about oasis agriculture. You think it's nothing to do with migration. I thought so too, so I went to the south of Morocco. I was an environmental geographer and stayed there for half a year. But I discovered I couldn't explain anything in a country like Morocco without thinking about migration. Because what happened in those small villages I stayed in, people moved. They moved to big cities, they moved to Europe, they sent money back. They also brought new ideas back, and everything was changing, including agriculture. So this is how I was drawn into migration. But I think it also put me on a certain trajectory which is perhaps atypical, because we have a very biased view of migration. I mean, depending on which country you live in, I think Poland is right in this sort of transition. Of course, migration from a Polish perspective for a very long time has been about Polish people moving abroad. But a typical Western perspective, Western European perspective, is about they're coming to us. And I think, as far as I understood in my conversations yesterday with some of your colleagues, Poland is right in this transition. And what is very typical for new immigration countries is to be in a state of denial. And this is the idea of, this is only temporary, we're going to stop it. We have some workers, okay, but it will go back someday. That is exactly what you could hear in Germany and the Netherlands back in the 1960s. And this is quite typical. We always have this very one-sided perspective of migration. And by and large, I think the narrative in the West is very much dominated by this immigration country perspective, this idea they're coming to us. How can we regulate it? How can we deal with the challenges? How can we stop people that we don't want at the border? There's not enough real interest and understanding of what migration means from the perspective of countries where people come from. And of course, we need both perspectives to have a real understanding of migration. And what typically happens in the transition, that countries that used to be emigration countries forget their own migration past. I mean, the ultimate champion of emigration was Italy. But Italians have completely forgotten about the fact that they were the big emigrators of the previous century, to give you an example. I guess if Poland follows the same pattern, the exact same thing may happen in Poland. Anyway, let me stop those comments. Migration, of course, is a very hot topic. And it seems in a way surprising. You would think a hot topic, a hot button issue. There's a lot of knowledge and interest in the topic. But the funny thing is that we have a whole field of migration studies, which is quite old. We talk about roughly a century of migration science, that very little of that knowledge actually plays a significant role in public debates. I don't have to explain that to you. Politicians, they make a lot of noise about immigration, and it's an extremely polarized debate. And that brings me to what I think is the main problem in the debate, and it also brings me to the need for a very different way of thinking about migration. The problem is the framing. The problem is not a lack of facts. We have so many facts, but facts won't save us. Facts alone won't save us, I would say. Yeah, we need facts, we need evidence, but facts alone won't change the way people look at things. And that has really to do with the framing of the debate. First, the public debate. And second, it has to do with a lack of a scientific view, even within academic research on migration, on the process of migration. We talk a lot about impacts of migration. We don't talk enough about the process of migration. Do we really understand the process of migration? I would say no. Although there is evidence, that evidence rarely ever reaches the debate. And that also explains why so many policies seem, on the longer term, to be failing. I mean, if you look at a longer term perspective, and this is very important because politicians often claim short-term victories, but if you look at the longer perspective, Just the European Union. European politicians have been arguing, have been proclaiming now for 35 years they will fight illegal migration. This is not new. We're just on the newest wave of the same narrative I've been hearing my whole life. It's old wine in new bottles. The real question to me is not whether you're against or in favor of migration. Why have those policies systematically failed to address the problems on our borders? That is a challenge. It would be foolish to say we don't have a migration problem. But I think the core problem is, beyond the rhetoric, beyond winning the next election, what have been the long-term results of those policies? I think we cannot but conclude it's been a complete failure. Now, one definition of insanity is trying to do the same over and over and over again and expect different results. I think it's an insane idea that current policies we have will fix the issue. I'll come back to that later. Back to the framing. What is the problem of the framing? I think the problem is the polarized framing in a sort of pro- and anti-migration way. And it is, of course, completely silly. Have you ever heard a journalist asking an economist whether she or he is in favor or against the economy? Or a climate scientist whether that person is in favor or against the weather? It's a completely stupid way to talk about migration. Of course, migration has positive aspects and negative aspects depending to whom you talk, of course, from what perspective you're looking at the issue. But of course, it's not a scientific, a serious way to look at the issue. So, if we continue to talk about migration in those terms, but it also includes the pro-migration camp, if you accept those terms of debate, and I guess there are quite some people in the room here that see themselves as pro-migration, get out of that frame. It's not a serious way of discussing migration. Don't take debate, I would say, from the anti-migration camp and not the other way around. It's a silly, unscientific, non-serious way of talking about a serious topic like migration. The key problem is it would be like thinking away a fundamental element of who we are as human beings and as societies. To me, it sounds like a cliche to say, again, migration is of all times, people have always moved, but I think it's a cliche worth repeating. That doesn't mean it's always good or bad. It's there, and it will be there. And if we don't accept that very fundamental fact, we can also not address the challenges that migration could also bring. If the presumption is, or the idea is that migration is like something you can turn off and on like a tap, any policy is bound to fail. And I think this is a presumption of quite a lot of the debates. It's a completely wrong way of thinking. And this simplistic framing has been paralyzed migration debates for decades now, and is a major obstacle for getting a better understanding because it leaves no room for nuance. And in the book I recently written, How Migration Really Works, and the title tries to say is, I try basically to outline a century of evidence of what we know about migration and how it defies many common understandings of migration, both on the left and on the right. This is not only right-wing myths. You see a whole series of misunderstandings about the nature and causes of migration across the political spectrum. So many policies are either ineffective or completely counterproductive because they are not based on a real understanding of migration, of the process of migration. Now, just lumping facts into the debate is not going to help us. Because what's happening on a political level, we're dealing with a lot of propaganda and ideological views that needs to be pushed. So, talking truth to power, as Edward Said has famously summarized the vocation of the intellectual, is not enough. And to quote Noam Chomsky, the power already knows truth, they're busy distorting it. And this is exactly the conclusion I came to when I was studying migration narratives and the way migration is represented, not only by right-wing politicians, also by humanitarian organizations, also by the UNHCR, also by IOM. They represent particular perspectives on migration that are quite biased and quite one-sided. So we just new facts won't help us. We need facts, of course, and the evidence needs to enter the debate, but it's bound to fail if we don't find a different way of not just talking about migration, but also achieving a fundamental scientific understanding of migration, which has been lacking so much. And that new paradigm that I'm advocating is to not look at migration a priori as a problem to be fixed or as a solution to problems like aging, but as an intrinsic part of much larger processes of social transformation and economic development. That we will always fail to understand migration if we don't see how migration is a fundamental and therefore inevitable part of much bigger processes of change in different ways than we often think. And that should not only be the basis of a new scientific understanding of migration, but I think also that kind of understanding will also help us to develop policies that will be more effective. So yes, we need a scientific paradigm. It's like economic science has been quite useful to understand how to manage a recession, for instance. If governments during a recession are going to massively cut back spending, you may reinforce the depression. And some economic recipes sound quite counterintuitive. It's the same with migration. There's a lot of counterintuitive things in migration. Now, I've written about 22 myths about migration. It's impossible to cover all 22, so I'll pick out 4 or 5. And I hopefully will convince you that we need to develop a really different understanding of migration. And I deliberately picked out left and right-wing myths and some myths that are shared across the board. So to avoid any easy thinking, it's all them who see it wrongly. I think we collectively have developed a wrong way of looking at migration, which has penetrated very deeply, not into just our consciousness, but also our subconsciousness, how we look at migration, particularly migration from the so-called global south to the so-called global north. Let me start with the first one, and I think this is the most widely shared one. It's this idea that we live in times of unprecedented mass migration. It is advocated by the far right, by the left, by the UNHCR, by the IOM, by almost any pundit and expert you'll hear talking about migration. And the assumption is we have poverty, inequality, conflict, climate change, and on top of that we have all this modern infrastructure, means of communication, transport, internet. It's become so much easier to gather information about other places, to go to other places, etc., etc., etc. It sounds very intuitive. And this is then also linked with this idea, it's easier to move. We see all these problems in the world, conflict, poverty, inequality, and that then leads to mass migration. That's what we see. And this is sort of linked to the idea migration is spinning out of control. We can also hear it in the narratives of IOM and UNHCR when they put out another press statement. We have the highest ever number of migrants or refugees in the world. I don't have time now to elaborate on my critique on their methodologies, which are a bit problematic. I understand why they're doing it, because they want attention and funding, but I think there's a problem. It's a very one-sided perspective. But everything amalgamates into a notion of a migration or refugee crisis. And interestingly enough, both on the left and the right, there's a certain interest in pushing that argument. Now, to address this border crisis, which allegedly is caused by all these problems in the world and the ease of travel, etc., the right and the left have very different solutions. On the right, you'll hear more often, we need to secure the border even more. On the left, you'll hear, we need to solve those problems. We need to send development aid so people no longer have to migrate. And some people will come up with a mix, which is happening in practice. I'll come back to those later, and those are problematic in themselves. But the fundamental presumption that migration is spinning out of control and accelerating fast needs to be questioned if we look at the evidence. We have roughly 280, we can speculate about numbers forever, roughly 280 international migrants in the world, which is roughly 3.5% of the world population. If we go back in time 50 years, the percentage was similar, which means, well, numbers of migrants have gone up, so has the world population, but the relative pace of migration hasn't actually increased. Look at refugees. Well, it's very erratic. Of course, we've just been through an episode with Ukrainian refugees. But if you look at the longer term, patterns are actually quite stable. Roughly 1 out of every 10 international migrants is a refugee, so 0.35%. Illegal migration, it is a problem on the border, definitely, and I'll come back to that later. But it's not as massive as we think, because we're very much influenced by the mass media and the political narratives that only focus, in the case of the UK, on the boats or people crossing borders illegally, the fences. We have to put this in perspective. Depends a bit on what country, but in many European countries, some estimates have been made. Perhaps 10% of all migrants either cross borders illegally or just overstay their visas, are in undocumented status, and those numbers are necessarily going up. So these are real problems, I'll come back to that, but it is not as we easily see things out of proportion. And it illustrates the extent to which our ideas have been distorted by political narratives and media coverage. Most migration is legal. Most migration is orderly, as IOM likes to put it. Some migration isn't, but that has probably always been the case. So we don't really see a third world exodus in the numbers. We don't see an invasion if we look at actual numbers. But some fundamental things change, which from a European perspective in particular makes it completely understandable that we think in Europe that migration is at an all-time high. And also in the United States, although that has always been an immigration country, because the character of migration has fundamentally changed. And that has everything to do with the changing place of Europe on the global migration map. Because ever since the so-called discovery of the Americas by Columbus in 1492, it were of course Europeans who for over 4 centuries moved out of Europe to colonize other lands. Soldiers, enslavers, colonists, missionaries, settlers, and later ordinary migrants, of course, colonized the Americas and later on also most other parts of the world. And these were truly huge numbers. Just between 1870 and 1850 and the First World War, some 50 million Europeans on a world population that was way smaller moved out to the Americas. And it was really a huge movement. And did Europeans ever ask permission to do so to the native inhabitants of those lands? No. So this is what I discuss with my students. How do you define illegal migration? Well, European colonization arguably was the biggest illegal migration in human history. Of course, same in Russia. But Russia didn't have to go overseas. They just colonized the Far East, Siberia, Central Asia, up to Alaska. So Europe expanded. And of course, population movement was part of that expansion. This was an invasion. Unlike migrants today, Europeans did come with weapons and gunboats. But since the Second World War, and this is still ongoing, those patterns have been fundamentally reversed. And this is what I call the global migration reversal, which makes it totally understandable that we have a migration debate in Europe. Because Europe transformed from the major emigrating continent in terms of long-distance moves, because people have always moved over long distances. Europeans went to America, Australia, New Zealand. So the idea that we move over much bigger distances, Europeans have started to move less, actually. Why? Decolonization, of course. Europe lost its colonies, at least Western Europe lost them. And that meant that some people moved back to the mother or fatherland, but later growing labor shortages, growing wealth, aging, all these processes caused increasing labor migration, starting with the so-called guest workers from Southern Europe initially, later from Turkey, North Africa, and nowadays from pretty much all over the world. So Europe has become this attraction point. Well, moving to America, America has always been an immigration country, but migration to America always used to be European, obviously. Preferably Anglo-Saxon. Later on, grudgingly, the Americans accepted Eastern Europeans, Jews, Southern Europeans, who initially didn't really fit into the idea of who's a real American because they were Catholic or Jewish or Eastern European. It's not really what we want, but they accepted it. So the idea of America was still a white nation. When the European labor supply fell away, because things were going so well in Europe after the Second World War, Europeans were basically replaced by Mexicans and Caribbeans, and later on by Asians. So immigration is not new, but the composition of world migration changed completely. Europeans basically stopped moving to America. In 1950, 90% of immigrants in the United States were European. Now it's only 10%. So it's a changing background, the changing ethnic background of migrants that has been the real change, not a sort of overall number increase. And of course, that Europe has become this destination. So it's not about numbers. It's about composition and about the changing directions. There is no swelling flood of desperate people on the way to Europe necessarily. And the vast majority, very importantly, of people move within their own countries or neighboring countries. And perhaps the most significant... Did you know there are more internal migrants in China than international migrants in the world? The real migration of modern times, I'm talking about the last 200 years, has been the big transfer from rural to urban areas. About 4/5 of all migrants in the world move within countries. That is the real migration, the real great migration, I would say. International migration is relative, it's 1/5 roughly of all people moving. But the most, I think, significant fact is despite all the problems we have in the world, despite violence, poverty, challenges people have in their livelihoods, at least 96% of the world population is in their native country. There's a huge bias for people to stay at home. That brings me to a scientific point. If we want to understand why people move, it's a very biased question. Let's start by asking ourselves, why do most people actually stay? Cannot be explained by all this push-pull perspective. Anyway, conclusion, yeah, migration can cause challenges, but there's no reason for panic. Second myth we often hear, border restrictions reduce migration. And kind of sounds like a no-brainer, right? Yeah, of course, borders are not perfect, we know that. You need to create a kind of North Korean totalitarian state to perfectly seal off a border. That's probably not what we want. But still, to build a fence and a wall and make it more difficult to migrate legally, it probably will at least reduce some of the inflows. And most evidence seems to suggest in the longer term it will. But still, we have evidence that migration restrictions that are not really thought through, so ill-conceived immigration restrictions, can increase net migration. Net migration is people coming in minus people going out. And that's what interests politicians, because often they don't want migrants to stay. They want them to work for a few years and go back. Well, a scientific view on migration means that we first of all have to understand that migration rarely ever is a one-off move from country or place A to country or place B. It is a circular process. If migration is free, like within countries or within the European Union, people tend to go back and forth a lot. They go to study, pick up a job, visit somebody, stay for a while and go back. Once you lose a job, you've earned enough money, most people, not everybody goes back, some people will stay, but it is a very fluid kind of thing, like migration within a country. The real question is, and this poses the real dilemma of migration policymaker, and that's why I say it's complex, it's not easy. So, of course, governments, sovereign states have a legitimate right to want to control immigration, but there are some real policy dilemmas, because if you make it more difficult to come, and this is what we know from a lot of scientific evidence, also econometric studies I've been involved in, the more difficult it is to come, the less migrants are likely to go back. And this is what happened with the guest workers in the 1970s, when Western European countries made it more difficult for them to come from Turkey and North Africa. They stayed put and decided to bring their families over. This is what I call the migration multiplier. So ending up with a much bigger number than the initial workers. This is why a circular flow of Mexicans going to California and Texas mainly was transformed ever since this fence building was started. It wasn't Trump, by the way. It started in 1986. Was transformed in a permanently settled migrant population of often undocumented, up to 11 to 12 million people in Mexico. And this is still what we see in Europe, that if a crisis, a recession breaks out, it's typically the non-EU migrants who stay put and don't go back, and it's European migrants who don't go back. So it is difficult. And some unintended effects may happen. When my native country, the Netherlands, wanted to decolonize one of their colonies called Suriname in South America, the real motive of the Dutch government in 1975 wasn't really to stop to make the country independent. They actually wanted to stop free migration because Surinamese citizens were Dutch citizens. That meant we could not do anything to stop their immigration. So the idea was we push them out of the kingdom, we de-Dutchify the Surinamese and they won't be able to come. Guess what most Surinamese thought with the deadline of 1975 and the introduction of visas in 1980? It is now or it is never. And you got a huge migration wave in which 40% of Suriname's population moved to the Netherlands before it was too late. There are many reasons for this, but one of the mechanisms that also explains why when the UK left the European Union, net migration to Britain quadrupled after Brexit, the exact opposite of what Brexit was supposed to establish. So it isn't easy, it is complex. And it is actually quite surprising how few journalists ask critical questions to politicians about, hey, you wanted this Brexit, right, to reduce migration. Why didn't it work? We all focus on the boats, which is, I think, in Britain, 4 to 5% of all inflows, which is a problem, but it's not the bulk of migrants coming into the UK. Because migrants stay put. If it becomes more difficult, the more you have to invest in your migration, the less likely you're going to give up and go back because you may not be able to go back again, re-migrate. So it is complex, migration management. It is not like opening and closing a tap if you don't address the root causes of migration. Well, that brings me to the next myth. And this is what you hear a lot in progressive circles. Yes, indeed, borders don't work. I think that is also too bold of a statement. But anyway, we know they are at least problematic and they haven't done what we wanted them to do. So something's wrong. So the answer is we need to address the root causes of migration. The Biden administration also bought into this narrative. We need to provide development aid. We need to help people to stay at home. This steps into this idea that immigration, particularly from the global south, is a desperate flight from misery. Interesting thought, why don't we think Europeans of ourselves that way? Why would we presume that, let's say, Africans have fundamentally different reasons for migrating than we, the Polish or Germans or Dutch have or had? But I leave that aside. The problem is, if we look at the evidence, that we really have to question this victim thinking of migrants that lack agency. The representation of migrants as economic refugees fleeing oppression, poverty and violence, or as victims of smugglers and traffickers who sell false images of the European El Dorado, who have no job to come, will only be exploited, and we see the images of people dying and suffering at the border. Well, of course, some of these things do happen, but it's a very one-sided perspective that is not representative for the overall migrant experience. In general, and we have a lot of research here, shows that migration is generally an investment in a better future. That generally tends to pay off. It's an investment. Some investments fail, but most migrants, in my fieldwork, in ongoing fieldwork still in Morocco and in Senegal, if we talk to young people, they see it as an investment. I want to help my family. Look at my neighbor who's in Spain and built his house and sent their kids to university and things like that, or set up a small enterprise. That's really what people have in mind, and they have to prove around them. And that is what is really fueling migration. Migration primarily is driven by hope, ambition, and opportunity. The most important thing is migration is expensive. And that makes us question the whole fundamental assumption that poverty would be the main driver of South-North migration. Actually, we have to reverse the perspective. Absolute poverty deprives people of the means to migrate. The biggest victims of economic crisis, of oppression, warfare, if you'd like, climate change, are those people who cannot move. Because migration is often a way to find better opportunities, to decrease risks of income risks of household, to gain some extra money, experiences, opportunities, which cost money. What are the main emigration countries in the world? Just look around you. Well, we are in one of them, Poland. For the EU, certainly a very important emigration country. It's declining now, but it has been for decades. But just globally, look at the so-called global south. Mexico, Turkey, Morocco, the Philippines. Are these the poorest countries in the world? No, they're all middle-income countries. And that's no coincidence, because we have this theory of the mobility transition. Wilbur Zelinsky, an American demographer, hypothesized it already back in 1971, and Ronald Skeldon, a Scottish geographer, picked that up, and I feel I stand a bit in their tradition. They have always argued that migration has been part of development. People have started moving more when country modernized. When you have this big transfer from rural to urban, when the whole society is changing, people start to get on the move. And this is also backed up by empirical evidence. If poor countries become richer, more people start to move, both from rural to urban areas and internationally. Only when countries really reach high income status, migration tends to decline. And that is exactly what's happening in Turkey and Morocco right now. They're becoming immigration countries for that reason, and Poland is already way beyond that point, obviously. So we cannot blindly apply this to countries, but there are clear regularities. So any form of development in the poorest countries of the world, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, will inevitably lead to more migration, not because of a lack of development, but exactly because of development. That is not an argument against development. It's just to say, well, it doesn't work like that. And how does it work? And this is why I try to come up with a sort of new theory to explain it. It's not just about money. Migration is also about life aspirations, changing ideas of the good life. Now, a migrant is a person who's currently living in a different place than you were born. So who is a migrant here? Can I see some hands? Are you amongst the poor and miserable? No. And it tells a story. I always ask this to my students as well. It is very selective process, as economists would tell it, but it's not just about money and migration being expensive. Migration development, as we call it, let's take, well, there's a lot of contestation about what is development, and we can have long debates about that. But we would probably all agree that poverty reduction and better education is good, right? Quite universally adopted idea. What is that to migration? I think we have to reconceptualize human mobility, first of all, as the ability of people to decide where to live, including the option to stay at home. I already said, most people actually stay at home. That is mobility freedom, having the liberty to stay or to go. If we take that away from people, you create a migration-obsessed society that takes those no one ever chances to get out whenever the opportunity presents itself. The other thing is that we have to reconceptualize in this new paradigm migration as a function of aspirations and capabilities to move. Now, the capabilities part is pretty obvious. You need economic resources. A certain education will help you to get the right paperwork and jobs abroad to migrate and things like that. And of course, social capital, contacts, networks. So you need to be resourced to a certain, you need the capabilities. But the aspiration, that is typically what we see with education and access to media. We did some surveys in Ethiopia which convincingly showed, and also some other African countries, that the more people get educated, the more they want to move, and it makes complete sense. It is not just about economic opportunities and the fact that you probably can't find your kind of dream job in a small place and you have to move, or perhaps even abroad, but also about people's different kind of lifestyles, which are no longer connected to the rural agrarian life. And my well-educated friends in rural Morocco, whose parents were still peasants, say, well, I don't want to work on the farm, even if that farm was quite prosperous. So this goes beyond economic. It goes beyond really the money. It is really about people's changing life aspirations. And that shows that migration is an inevitable part of development. And it completely reverses the standard ways. Some of you may have heard about the push-pull model, and we think this poverty push. Actually, poverty deprives people of the means to move. And I've done quite some research because of my own background in environmental geography about the links between environmental degradation, climate change, and migration. The irony, or the bitter irony, is the biggest victims in the future of climate change that will be deprived of everything they have are the people who cannot move. And that is also the main reason why almost everybody doing research, there's a broad consensus emerging in this field of research that yes, climate change can lead to displacement, but it will be short distance. Probably mostly temporary, but it will not be linked to massive transcontinental moves of people. It doesn't make any sense at all if you look at the evidence. The biggest victims of climate change are those people who will get stuck in dangerous situations. And there are many reasons to think that any form of deprivation will lead to less or to more migration. Again, it is complex. There is no simple linear relation between poverty and migration. The most vulnerable will be stuck in what Jürgen Carling, a Norwegian migration researcher, called involuntary immobility. So we have to reverse our thinking about the very nature and causes of migration. We also have to de-essentialize the way we think about South-North migration. I said this before. Why do we always presume that Africans are always moving for misery reasons? We've done, also when I was still at Oxford, we've done a lot of research with teams in Ghana, Nigeria, Morocco, Senegal, and most Africans move for pretty similar reasons as Europeans, to get a degree, to join family members, or to pick up a job. So the media representation of those migrations is highly biased towards refugee kind of situations, really problematic, but it's a very biased view. That brings me to the fourth, almost last myth, perhaps I'll add one more. Because we're still looking, what are the real causes of migration? Well, we found part of the answer, it is development. If we look at a society-wide perspective, it is the deep social transformations that come with modernization and sort of the economic changes that are part of it, but also the cultural changes that are part of it. Inevitably, societies will get on the move. Particularly in that midterm phase with big demographic transitions, economic transitions, infrastructure development, societies will get on the move. Only when societies really become rich, they tend to produce less migration, but they then inevitably become destination countries. And that brings me to the second aspect. Yeah, development increases the development potential of societies. But when the crisis hit the Spanish economy in 2008 and unemployment was skyrocketing in Spain, Moroccans, again, I come back to the Moroccan example. This is where I did most of my research. There was barely any Moroccan who thought about going to Spain at that point of time because everybody understood there was no jobs. Why would you pay a smuggler or put so many resources in a visa if you know you're going to be unemployed? So people stop migrating. And that brings me to another myth. And I'll pick up the theme again, which is this idea that migrants steal jobs and drive down wages and all of that kind of thing. It's very part of the, actually originally a left-wing narrative. It's important to remind that right-wing parties are not necessarily more restrictive in immigration than left-wing parties. Actually, if we go a bit back in time, it were generally the political right that was in favor of the guest worker migration, to Northwestern European because it served industrial corporate interests. And then the accusation of trade unions, but it's basically that the argument has been taken over by the far right, is that migrants are responsible for the social problems, increasing inequality, growing job insecurity we face in many Western countries. Well, first of all, there's no really sound econometric evidence to really sustain such big claims. We see that even with big migration shocks, as the Syrian influx, millions of Syrians going to Turkey, or indeed Ukrainians to Poland, I was informed yesterday, don't change much in terms of average wage levels and employment levels. Basically, the whole economy becomes bigger, the whole economic pie becomes bigger, the average size of the pie roughly stays equal. We can have a long debate about the marginal effects, but roughly, it doesn't really show up in the evidence. And this is because, also more fundamentally, we have to turn around the main causality of the argument. We're all fixated on what is the impact of migration on our workers. But the other way around causal relationship is much more powerful. Labor demand is the most important fundamental driver of immigration. Without labor demand, you would almost lose the engine. Of course, family members also move along with labor migrants. Some people move for completely different reasons, but we see it time and again, this labor demand has always been the driving factor, and recruitment, of course, of migrant workers. And this is right now happening in Poland, is in this transition of becoming this big new European destination. In other words, migrants come to fill vacancies, not to take jobs. Most migrants wouldn't show up if there was not a reasonable prospect of finding a job. And this is why we see an extraordinarily high correlation between the business cycle and levels of immigration. If there's not a lot of very low unemployment, if there's big shortages, employers will recruit workers from abroad. If the economy tanks, much less migrants will come and many actually will go back, particularly those who have freedom of movement. Well, that shows something, I think, important if we think about the debate. Because if the business cycle, if the economy is actually driving immigration, by far the most effective way to curb immigration is to wreck your economy. And that's, of course, not what politicians want. So we're trying to sort of create ourselves an illusion. We can have this open, successful market economy, plus an aging population, and we can significantly curb immigration. The English say you can't have your cake and eat it too. And this, I think, is the elephant in the room of the migration debate. We hear a lot of politicians, in my country too. We need, in UK too, we need higher skilled migrants, but everybody knows we only need higher skilled migrants, but everybody knows that's a lie. Look who's working in the platform economy, look who's delivering food, look who's picking up the vegetables, who's working in hotels and restaurants all across big Western cities, and you know the answer, who's cleaning private homes? It's just not true. But it's this political taboo nobody talks about. And that's the elephant in the room of the migration debate. Labor demand, not poverty or inequality or lack of development, is the most important root cause of migration. Yeah, conflicts, yes, but I already told you, refugee migration is relatively small compared to the real driver of increasing migration to the West, which is true. There has been an increase in immigration that has mainly to do with increasing labor shortages, also driven by aging. And that is something I really hope journalists will become more aware of. There's a huge discursive gap, as I call it, between the tough rhetoric of politicians on immigration and their policy practices, which are much more lenient than their tough rhetorics seem to suggest. That is particularly apparent in the wide-scale toleration of illegal labor, undocumented migrants doing all sorts of jobs, to which politicians are all too happen to turn a blind eye toward. At the same time, and this is also what journalists don't realize, this government have lower barriers for lower skilled migration for various categories of worker. So we all focus on asylum and the border, it almost distracts the attention away from the real thing, that actually political field has largely responded to businesses and broader economic interests, but also think about care and personal care. This is not just about personal big corporations. Well understood social and economic interests that we understand that these are actually vital workers. And this is why government in practice turn a blind eye. Donald Trump has stopped workplace controls in big farms in California. Nobody knows that. All the focus is on that one deportation flight to El Salvador, and it distracts the attention away. One statistic, and this is, by the way, true for most Western countries, we try to collect data also on Poland on labor enforcement. It's almost impossible to get, because I don't think governments wanted to know this thing. But the US, I think 10 million employers, I forgot the exact number, but it's a lot. Guess, despite all the rhetorics, if you really want to address illegal migration, the exploitation of undocumented migrants, their ruthless exploitation in the workplace, we all agree this is not a good thing, right? But you have to address it at the source. As long as we tolerate this, so this statistic is the following. I was shocked when I heard it. The number, because I looked up the data, I think how many employers in the US get actually criminally prosecuted for exploiting undocumented migrants on a yearly basis? Guess. 15 to 20. No zeros added, no percentages. It's roughly the same chance of being hit by lightning. I just had a team of students looking at Poland, looking at the Netherlands, looking at Japan, Germany, countries that have this very self-righteous image, like Southern Europe always messes it up, we know how to do it. They don't have even statistics, and the statistics we have actually confirm there is no willingness to enforce labor law. We already have the laws, because we all understand. And this is the organized political hypocrisy around immigration. And that is across the political board. This is not just a right-wing problem. We don't talk about the elephant in the room. And this brings me to the end of my talk. Just one remark before I conclude. It's also important to keep in mind that this idea that migration lifts all boats, it's good for everybody, I think we have to be very careful with that argument too. Migration is also not a solution. We have to get rid of this idea, either a problem or a solution. It is there. Because there's also quite some evidence to bust the myth that migration can solve the aging problem. Yeah, aging will increase labor shortages, but immigration will not solve the aging problem. That requires much different policy measures. But also, evidence quite clearly shows it's primarily the better off that benefit economically from immigration, who employ migrants or benefit from the services, and that lower skilled native workers barely benefit economically from migration, or sometimes even lose a little bit, but particularly I think, and this is politically relevant, they do see the real changes migration can bring to their neighborhoods, their workplaces, the schools their kids go to. And I think the political elites have been quite blind to that fact. So we have to think, how do we organize migration? How do we avoid exploitation of migrant workers? I think it's part of the problem. And that brings me to my conclusion. So I hope these few examples convince you that what we need is not just facts, but a totally new vision and paradigm on migration, about its nature and causes, as an intrinsic and therefore inevitable part of broader change. Well, I've been asked the question, do we have a migration crisis? Never say no if people ask that to you. Yes, we do have a migration crisis, but I would add it's a political crisis. So the inability, I just said, 40 years of failed policies, that's a problem. Migrants suffering, both at the border and workplaces, that's a problem. Problems of integration, segregation, neighborhoods where migrants are marginalized and concentrate, and also native people live, and overcrowding, that's a problem. It's caused by policy failure. With regards to refugees, it's a crisis of solidarity. Just to give the European example, we could deal with Ukrainian refugees all of a sudden, but when it's about non-European, it's suddenly a different story. Numbers are actually smaller. Europe has 450 million EU inhabitants. Germany and Austria were right to complain that they were actually carrying disproportionate high responsibility and that the rest of Europe is kind of having a free ride on their hospitality. I think if Europe gets its act together, we could easily deal with it. It's a crisis of solidarity not only with refugees, but also amongst European nations. The Dutch far right may champion Viktor Orban, but what I don't say is that before Viktor Orban doesn't accommodate refugees, they will move on to the Netherlands. So it is a constant shifting away of the problem to your next neighbor, and that's not a solution. The only solution, there's no easy solution to the refugee issues, is of course real European solidarity between borderline states and between states further afield. With regards to the rest of migration, which I want to stress is the bulk of migration, we need to address the crisis is a crisis of political hypocrisy, in which acts of political showmanship and migration scapegoating conceal the true, much more liberal nature, I would say neoliberal nature of our migration policies, or actually the policies that are not implemented. And the huge gap between tough rhetoric of fighting illegal migration on the one hand and the large-scale toleration of the employment and exploitation of both legal and undocumented migration. Now, I don't want to end on this pessimistic note. I think the hypocrisy is an important thing. And anybody who gets involved in public debates, since the publication of my book, I've been in a lot of TV studios, a lot of debates. And this is one of the things I discovered. You have to acknowledge there are problems with migration. Doesn't mean you're against migration or you're migrant scapegoating, but you have to play the ball back into the political court. We have to address this political hypocrisy. Why do the same politicians that proclaim to be against immigration tolerate all these abuses and exploitation of migrant workers? People will always keep on coming if that continues, because it's still much better than to stay in, let's say, Mexico, Morocco, or Senegal. People will keep on coming because there's a big gain for them in migration. Remittances are, 3, 4, 5 times more than development aid. So for migrants, personal migrants, there's a clear gain in migrating. So as long as we tolerate that they find work, even if they get exploited, people will keep on coming. However, what I also discovered while doing background research for my book is that the reason for to be optimistic, to break through this polarization and this deadlock. And that is actually based on long-term opinion research, which kind of challenges the myth that the public has generally turned against immigration. Actually shows that most people have rather nuanced and often quite ambiguous position about immigration. While many people worry about how immigration may affect their lives and communities, most people also understand that many migrants do essential work and agree that refugees deserve protection. There's a huge gap between political rhetoric and public opinion, which is much more nuanced. And to me, this shows, it's a reason for optimism, that voters are much more level-headed about immigration than our elected leaders, who surface very poorly with their simplistic narratives. So equipped with the right knowledge, there is reason for optimism about the potential for having a more nuanced debate about immigration to develop also policies that avoid current problems and make migration work better for all members of origin societies. However, this is the insight that this new paradigm brings of migration as part of much bigger processes, and we cannot decouple debates about immigration from much broader debates about economic policies, inequality, the platform or the gig economy, the future of labor, welfare, who will take care of our children, the sick and the elderly in the future. And to me, and this is also the final point of my book, that ultimately any sensible debate, any real and serious debate about migration should therefore be a debate about the kind of society we want to live in. Thanks for your attention.
Ladies and gentlemen, Hein de Haas.
Thank you.
You absolutely deserve them. And now we have Alex over there, who is one of our great volunteers. And questions. Do we have any questions in the question jar? Or do we have, I can see one hand very high up over there. And Alex, the next person, is sitting here.
Thank you so much for brilliant lecture. I really enjoyed listening to this. My name is Karolina Sobczak-Szelc from Warsaw University, from Center of Migration Research and Faculty of Geography and Regional Studies. I need to admit that somehow I followed your path. I did my research in Egypt in 2003, in Morocco since 2004, then in Tunisia. Tanzania, Bangladesh, also Peru. And I was listening and admitting that we conclude with so many common conclusions. However, I see some, maybe not gaps, but points that are not fulfilled. You've mentioned that most of migrations are internal. You've mentioned about the aspirations, capabilities to move, actually not talking about aspirations, capabilities to stay. And that's the point that actually shows also my research, that people's aspirations, capabilities to move and to stay change along the migration trajectories. Sometimes they aspire to reach United States if they flee Venezuela, but it seems on the way that Lima in Peru is just enough. The changes are between generations, so all the generation, the city is enough, the younger is willing to move forward to Europe, not seeing their aspirations or their capabilities to stay in the city, which was their primary goal.
Yeah.
And just like, I fully agree with the idea that like migration is not a risk. I see it as a challenge that we need to manage. Thank you so much.
So it was rather a comment than a question.
You want me to?
Yes.
Right, yeah.
Can we have a question?
Yeah, I mean, of course, I couldn't deal with the complexity. I think you're fully right to say aspirations are not just about moving, but also about staying. But this is why I think the notion that we need to rethink human mobility freedoms as the capability of people to decide where to live, I think is quite a fundamental one. Because if we also want to understand why some policies tend to create these huge migration waves, which then become self-defeating, because the sort of huge influx of people, once you open this border, will then create political panic, which will lead to political backlash, and then it becomes very difficult. I think it's partly explained by the fact that people don't have these mobility freedoms. So when I talk to young Moroccans of different generations, there's Moroccans of different generations. The old generation, less people above my age, they still remember they would just have their own gap years, like many Europeans have them, right? They would go to Spain, not necessarily to settle, to work a bit, to have a good life, to go to a bar, to meet a girl, you know, things like that, and go back. Most of them would go back. Migration is not just about a means to an end. It's also about living the life, particularly for young people. And most of them would then conclude to go back. Some of them would, of course, end up staying. The idea is, what do you do to the psychology of migration once you create this barrier? You create this, what I call this migration obsession, or this now or never mentality. And then you get, I think, what we see actually on European borders. And that poses a huge policy dilemma. But I don't think policymakers take enough in the psychology of migration into account. I hope that's kind of an answer to your question. Yeah.
Paweł Kaczmarczyk, I had two questions, in fact. And the first one is inspired by you because you mentioned Wilbur Zelinsky. And in one of his phases, he predicted that at some point we should be able to avoid mobility.
Yeah.
So the first question is, what do you think will or could be the impact of technologies and technological change on migration?
Yeah.
And the second point is about the book. Because in my opinion, it's just a powerful myth-busting exercise. And it's interesting because when I just discussed it with my students, they found it very persuasive. And my question is, what about politicians and policymakers? What's their reaction? So if you could just comment on this.
Yeah. Thanks for both questions, excellent questions. The first one, yeah, I do try to address it in my book. It's one of this idea that technology, so I try to challenge the myth like poverty increases migration, well, beyond some point of deprivation, poverty can deprive people of the means to move. But I think this question is also fundamental. Actually, some research seems to show and seems to confirm. I mean, Zelensky was quite visionary. He 1971, he already said I hit this graph, increased mobility, technology absorbing mobility. And he almost foresaw Zoom and things like that, although there was no computer at his time. But this is his fundamental scientific understanding that, again, it's a very sloppy way to think that technology and easier transport and communication will increase migration. Well, it evidently increases non-migratory mobility. I'm lumping in another concept. So commuting and tourism and business visits. But yeah, nowadays you can, even without moving, you can do many things. And there is actually evidence that in the most advanced economies, mobility is going down. Most people can work on distance, and most people don't want to give up everything in their homes just to have a slightly better life because people already have it quite good. So part of Zelensky's framework is also that migration and mobility will go down at some point. So we may actually face a future which is almost impossible to imagine for current policy environment of decreasing mobility. But there is actually, I remember that European policymakers, I remember when the Schengen visa was introduced, 1991 was a big debate in Morocco as well. And the word of the day was that this would, with free EU mobility, we would no longer need non-European workers. We just source them from Western Europe, from Eastern Europe, and we solved the problem. It obviously didn't happen, partly because actual levels of internal mobility in the EU are lower than policymakers had expected and hoped for. And it seems to tie into this. So we may move to a future where the question is no longer how do we stop people from coming, but actually how do we still get people? That is already true for higher skilled workers, but it may more and more be the case for skilled manual workers. This is also skilled work, by the way, and requires able-bodied, strong, and quite skilled people and motivated people. And these skills may also become more scarce. The only big region in the world where there is a huge potential still is Sub-Saharan Africa and some parts of South Asia. Your second question, policymakers. To round off the first point, so there's as many reasons to think that technological process leads to more as to less migration. Again, it's complex. It's a science migration, like economic science. It's a social science, like economic science. And the world is messy, and we can never perfectly predict things, but we can speculate that these things aren't as easy as we think. Policymakers, I had quite some talks to policymakers, particularly in the Netherlands, because yesterday, our government fell again over the asylum issue. So it's been an ongoing debate about immigration, although if they say immigration, it's actually only about asylum. I do believe that there are politicians around that want to know more and who actually read my book. But at the same time, politicians will tell you, as I said in my book, if I say what I really think about migration and what should really happen, I'm afraid it's going to be political suicide. Nevertheless, I do believe there is an electoral potential to tell this other story about migration. You will never attract the staunch, racist, far-right voter, but many people who vote for those parties are not necessarily racists. They may have certain worries about immigration. And I think if you see what is happening in some neighborhoods in Western Europe, where we consider migrants as workers, but not as people, and that reminds me of Max Frisch, the Swiss writer's famous dictum, we wanted workers, we got people instead. If we don't think about the social consequences, if we don't take care of those workers who we let in, and this is exactly what's happening right now all across Europe, we exploit workers, both legally and undocumented workers, that will create the next integration problem. And then we blame the migrants. Actually, it is governments who don't take responsibility, who sway to business lobbies to let people in, but don't take care of them once they want to settle and form families. And we create a next guest worker illusion. And I do think if there would be politicians, that's my hope, that dare to tell a new story. And I think I'm moderately optimistic, also based on opinion research. There's a big electoral base of people who are actually fed up with their hearing from politicians, which is mostly closed border now, but also the open border narrative. Both are just slogans. It's not any serious policy proposition. So I'm still hopeful. Otherwise, I wouldn't do this work.
Thank you very much. Last question, because we're already encroaching on lunch.
Thank you. I'm keeping the mic. I'm the chosen. Thank you very much for your lecture. It was absolutely great to listen to you and to see you. face to face. My name is Justyna Nakonieczna-Bartosiewicz. I'm specializing in international relations, and this is also the question referring to the migration from this context. And what is your opinion about the prospects that the United Nations present in Global Compact for Migration change the attitude to the migration? Because I have impression that this is the international document that had this idea to change the paradigm of the perception of the migration. However, in European countries, including Poland, it failed. We were against, the Polish government was against this, and a lot of countries decided to quit and to keep the position of the perception of the migration in the, let's say, classical, regular form, not going beyond. And have you searched this problem? What is your opinion about this? Thank you.
I think the Global Compact, the idea that the Global Compact will become directive in the same way as many other international law is working, being enshrined into national legislatures, I think is pretty slim right now because of the fundamentally opposed interests between the main sending and the main receiving countries. So to put it very, very boldly, there is a certain interest in many destination countries to not give too many rights to migrants, to see them as people you can use economically. And of course, origin states have an interest in defending the rights of their immigrants. So there is this fundamentally opposed interest. So that is, and secondly, we have sovereignty. We are living in a world of nation states, and any form of freer mobility is only possible if you give up some of that sovereignty. This is why the EU was such a hot button issue in the UK, because Brexiteers were right in a way to say, well, as long as we're part of the European Union and we have European citizenship, we can't stop the Polish to come. And so that was an empirically correct analysis. I'm not saying I'm in favor of those disintegration processes, but that is a lot. So, but I think it's an illusion in the short to medium term to think that the whole world will become one nation. So we still need immigration policy. So we will see those fundamental oppositions. However, I think it's good that countries talk about these things. I do really believe if we keep on talking, however imperfect those compacts, including the European sort of mechanisms on refugee, I have a lot of criticism on that as well. But at the same time, it's good that there is discussion. And I think in the longer term, that can create a better understanding. And also, I think some common interest and understanding that it is not a zero-sum game, because I think that's the main point. If we organize mobility in the right way, both origin and destination countries can benefit. And I think that requires, Max Weber talked about the slow boring of hard boards, to establish long-term change. But I think it's good that people are talking and that we make errors too. And we see that it doesn't work out. So I make no illusions about the compact solving all these things, but I think it's good there's a forum and people are meeting, and it can also take away some prejudice. So I think in the longer term, that's a good thing.
Thank you very much. Once again, Hein de Haas. Thank you very much, sir. Thank you. Well, ladies and gentlemen, there is one very important announcement to make before lunch, namely that please note that the opinions and views expressed here are those of the speakers and only and do not necessarily reflect those of the European Union or the organizers. Neither do the European Union or the organizers can be held responsible for those. Apart from one, the organizers hereby, with all the responsibility, announce that until 1 p.m. it is lunch break, which is also called the break for getting to know the person next to you, starting contacts, probably finding some old friends, and generally doing what the British call mingling. Please return here at 1 p.m. Thank you very much for being with us during the morning session. If you want to stroll out of the building, just to be on the safe side, please leave the headset for interpretation here in the building. Thank you.